Hamitaki. This is Nick Estes, host of the Red Nation podcast, but also we are cross-streaming and cross-publishing today with the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective, which I'm a part of. And we have two guests today to talk about empire's resources and the economic imperialism of our times. And I wouldn't have invited two other experts in this field, people whose work I admire, both as comrades but also as colleagues. And we'll start off. I'll have you each introduce yourself, and maybe we can start with Jeannette Graulau, if you want to just introduce yourself. Also talk about your work with the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective, which is the acronym is AISC.
Thank you, Nick, and it's a great pleasure to join the audience of Red Nation, and be here with Abby in what promises to be an exciting discussion. My name is Jeannette Graulau, and I work on mining history, the political economy of extractivism over centuries. So I am interested in Marxist questions of world history and how capitalism truly depends upon digging every single source of matter out there. So this is the kind of work I do, and I'm happy to be here today with you, sharing a bit of the explanations that come from my field that can allow us to make sense of the world we are living today. I am, as you said, a founding member of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective, and the work I do there is precisely, first of all, learn from an extraordinary and remarkable collective endeavor to understand the global turbulence of our times, and to do so from an anti-imperialist perspective. So it is an extraordinary source of knowledge for me, not just knowledge, but I want to emphasize of scientific knowledge. We are currently living in a time when the ruling class wants us to go back to a pre-scientific world. So the work we do at the collective is precisely build collectively the sort of the building blocks that allow us not just to understand imperialism today, but to wrestle with its contradictions so that we can plan collectively political action moving forward.
And next, I'll introduce Abby Sène.
Hi, thank you, Nick, and thank you, Jeannette, too, for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all today, and especially with the audience of the Red Nation podcast, a podcast that I have been following for quite some time now. So it's really an honor to be with you all today. So I am Abby Sène, and I am a associate professor in the area of conservation and development. I study conservation issues related to ecological agenda, conservation policies, focusing specifically in Africa, but also looking at how conservation basically serves imperialist expansion in Africa, right? Like, how does conservation work in service of global capitalism, but also in service of imperialism as well? I am also a member of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. I've been associated with the collective for about almost a year now. And as Jeannette presented, it's been a tremendous source of scientific knowledge, especially for myself, but also learning with comrades and adding much more needed clarity into the work that I'm doing in Africa regarding ecological issues. So part of my contribution, I'm looking forward to co-editing with a member of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. We're co-editing a special issue coming up in May on the AIS, which is the Alliance of the Sahel Federation, Alliance des États du Sahel, and also on Pan-Africanism. I am originally from Senegal, have lived throughout West Africa, including those three states. So I'm very, very much looking forward to co-editing our special issue with Layla Brown, who's another member of the collective. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for those introductions. I should probably talk about my membership in AISC as well. I joined after AISC was formed, but I also joined, from my own sort of vantage point from American Indian Studies, which I view as a discipline that has currents of anti-imperialist thoughts and analytic. Not always, that's not inherently anti-imperialist. But definitely the founders of the school and the discipline were, and very global in their thinking. So to be invited and asked to join this collective was a deep honor for me. And I'll say that I have learned so much, actually, not just in the months that I've been involved, but also just in the weeks that have passed, like especially with the recent war in Iran that had like a brief hours-long ceasefire that has been violated. But I've learned so much just from hearing from all the different perspectives on the origins of that war, and also the attack of imperialists on anti-imperialist states and projects. And so I'm deeply honored to be part of this collective, but also to engage in discussion and debate and conversation with my two colleagues here. And I wanted to just start with some basic, this seems basic concepts so that we understand, because the word imperialism gets thrown around a lot. We hear it in the mainstream media as talking about primarily sort of the military or sort of kinetic power of certain states, right? To invade, to attack, to occupy militarily, or to annex territory. But really, if we're looking at the history, especially the thought promoted by Lenin in the early 20th century, he asks us to consider the economic expression of imperialism and how it helps, and how that can help us understand what he calls the highest stage of capitalism, which is imperialism itself. So one of those concepts is this notion of monopoly capitalism. You might read certain texts, Marxist texts, and this word gets thrown around a lot. But maybe we can start off by defining this term. I'll turn to maybe Jeannette, if you want to take the first crack at it, about why is it so important to understand monopoly capitalism as a pillar of imperialism?
The question matters because I believe the safest path for understanding what it means and why it continues to determine the challenges, the possibilities, the struggle of the periphery. It's best if we look at it as monopoly capital deeply ingrained in the road to empire. Why the road to empire? Why the American empire? The path towards its own development, why it engendered, it gave birth to monopoly capital. And then on the other side of the question is obviously monopoly capital in relation to the sustainability of empire. And I know that I am venturing into the backyard of Abby's work, but this is my proposal for us to have this discussion today. In terms of the road to empire, monopoly capital obviously was instrumental. It was essential since the beginnings. It referred to the historical conditions under which capital, productive capital, industrial capital, agrarian capital, the historical conditions under which this form of capital truly embraced larger and larger areas of resource-rich peripheries of the world economy. This is what is at stake when we speak of monopoly capital from a natural resource perspective. It refers to the historical conditions under which an industrialist class precisely became industrialist, triumphed over its British competitors, its French competitors, its German competitors in the 19th century in the Atlantic world by encompassing larger and larger amounts of lands from its immediate neighbors, Latin America, and later on, the rest of the world. So it refers fundamentally to ferocious competition, ferocious competition geared towards amassing, capturing larger and larger amounts of resources. Now, obviously, there is an entire history here at stake. And we have to remember that it's North America, the United States entered into its rise towards that kind of monopoly capital stage in the 19th century. It entered into that stage with what we call resource deficits, geological scarcities. I know this might sound a bit perplexing to a general audience, socialized into thinking that the United States has always been a new Canaan, the land of abundant resources, the land where the gold rushes of Canada, of California, the gold rushes of Nevada, even the gold rushes of Alaska allowed the United States to endogenously, internally build the conditions to rise to the top. That is a Robin Hood story. It is a lie. It is a historical. It is part of what we call the ideological bourgeois history that I'm sure most of the audience and all of us learned in school. Now, the history obviously is more complex. You don't build monopoly capital. You don't build the conditions that allow you to exert monopolistic power, which means, again, ferocious competition for resources. You don't build those conditions in 1 decade, in 1 year. You don't build them in 1 century. You build them since the inception of this country. And I need not to remind the audience of the Red Nation podcast, that in the century, just think of the century of wars, the century of Indian wars, roughly in between the mid-18th century and the mid-19th century and more. But just to think of the first 100 years of Indian wars. These Indian wars were costly and depended upon the United States finding its own fresh sources of metals. This is a history we don't learn in school, but the numbers are there. The testimonies, the historical accounts are there. So when the United States wages the ferocious, the violent, the genocidal Indian wars, there was then the need to find its own domestic sources of minerals and metals, especially gold. Gold, because there was another dimension of the Indian wars, of the wars of the 18th and 19th century, was obviously the inter-imperialist competition in the Western Hemisphere. So waging wars internally and externally added the pressure for the United States to develop this voracious appetite for resources. Costly wars. The Indian wars, again, they are central to understanding the vision of the future that the empire built with respect to natural resources. So the United States wages wars against Indians, Amerindians, spends a century digging its own lands, waging at the same time wars against Britain in the Americas. For reasons we cannot explain here, but your audience knows very well that Britain, the British Empire, exercised monopolistic control over the largest bounties, the largest geological bounties of the Americas. So when we get to the 19th century, we already have a colossal machine within the United States, an economic motor, an economic engine, pushing the United States in the direction of grabbing every single good geological bounty of North America and beyond, systemically linked to the making of wars. These are two sides of one single coin. We learn in school that first came the Indian Wars, then the territorial acquisition of Mexico and beyond, then the wars in the late 19th century. But these are phenomena functionally connected. So warfare and the voracious hunger, the voracious appetite for minerals were since day one, the foundational motor of this economy. Now, obviously, it means that the United States enters the 20th century with certain structural makeup or structural limitations. If its rise in the 19th century, if it effectively eliminated imperialist competition, European competition, if it is going to claim the geological bounties of the Americas, if it is going to effectively defeat Amerindian populations in North America, it means that before it became an industrial superpower, it was already conditioned to the sort of geological grabbing that we are witnessing today. With the imperialist warfare in Cuba, Venezuela, and obviously in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So the United States enters the 20th century. I have to say, it's with a unique historical motor. No other empire in world history has had these two dimensions organically tied warfare and the need to have low-cost access to minerals. What does it mean for us, or trying to understand the 20th century and trying to understand the frontiers of progress, development, the kind of horizon that monopoly capital then is going to open in the 20th century? It's going to mean a lot of things. It's going to mean that in the 20th century, what we see then is that this kind of monopoly capital is radically different than the monopoly capital that characterized the British ruling class in the Victorian era. It's going to be radically different. And it's going to be radically different, again, because it is productive capital. It is industrial capital. It is capital that produces literally progress, that modernizes the economy. The United States in the early decades of the 20th century was already climbing immediately before the Second World War, but more so in the post-war period. But it's going to do so again with a very sinister side, because it means that if the road to sustain monopoly capital entails these two dimensions, warfare, production of means of warfare, production of means to annihilate populations, which in turn entails increasing consumption of minerals, critical minerals. It really means that long before the United States claimed to be the global superpower in the 1950s, 1960s, when actually its industrial capital exerted the kind of modern monopoly capital we can all distinguish. It means that the problem of that monopoly capital is more serious, because it is monopoly capital that produces profits, that expands its horizon for accumulation. And this is the logic of capital. Capital seeks to endlessly expand profits, nothing else. But it means that in order for this capital to do so, this is a form of capital that has to continually invest itself, plow itself into the production of means of warfare. This is huge. This is huge. The Spanish Empire had nothing comparable to this machine. The British Empire had nothing comparable to this machine. The Dutch commercial empire had nothing comparable to this machine. It's only the American empire, the one that has to combine both sides, waging wars since the 18th century, internally, domestically, and externally. The more war it wages, the more it learns how to grab and monopolize minerals and metals from geologists internally and external geologists. But while doing so, it is going to learn that to sustain monopoly capital and the ferocious competition it entails, it has to increasingly, progressively, continually turn itself towards the production of means of warfare. So when we get to the 1950s, 1960s, we truly have a radically different view of monopoly capital. Lenin did not predict it. Lenin was speaking about financial capital, financial monopoly capital. But the American monopoly capital built industrially, had this unique historical condition. It incessantly has to dynamite production of means of warfare in order to sustain its monopolistic capabilities.
Wow. I was waiting for you to keep going on that, Jeannette. That was a very thorough and deep analysis of this, and it actually illuminated. I was sitting there in my mind. I was like, I haven't seen that level of analysis, understanding indigenous history in relation to American empire, especially as you're talking about it as this structural conditioning unique to this particular historical model that requires accumulation, but then also constant warfare. That is such a powerful analytic to understand our current moment. It's also a powerful analytic to understand history and the construction of American empire and the resource grabbing that is intrinsic to it, as well as the constant militarization process. There's another element of this, and maybe both you and Abby can elaborate on this about financialization. And specifically, Jeannette, you talk about how global finance flows and alliances between North Atlantic states and multinational corporations facilitate and maintain control over global mineral resources. You already kind of laid the foundation, the historical foundation, but maybe you can expand a little bit about how this global trade is tied specifically to the U.S. arms industry. And how does the new Cold War with China impact that global trade of mineral resources? And why is it important in this particular moment in time? I know there's like 3 questions in there, but if you could start to answer that, and then I'll turn to Abby for some further questions.
Of course, this is it's the road to empire matters, right? It's just because this is not dead history. This is the machine of the empire. Now, in the 50s, in the 1950s, 1960s, right? It means obviously, and I'm going to stack together various historical arguments. It means that the United States truly overcame its geological deficits, its natural internal scarcities of resources. This country has them. Geologists in the 1950s were liberally writing about it. In the 1960s too. Despite obviously the good mines and the mini mining booms of the United States, it's implement that the United States put together these two. It truly monopolized all geological regions of the Americas. Now you have to think, and this is going to your question, Nick. You have to think that, this is only the Atlantic view. This is not only the Atlantic view, but I'm going to invite your audience to do what we do in the internal debates of our collective. You have to now take this map, pull it, push it, just let the map lay the map flat on the floor so that we can see the map of the world horizontally. In the 1950s, 1960s, when American corporations were truly enjoying monopolistic control of the best resources of Latin America in the 1950s and 1960s, obviously the Cold War is going to introduce certain vulnerabilities to the machine of monopoly power of the American capital. And in my view, the key pieces that began to threaten American industrial monopoly power, so that we can get to the monopoly power of finance. But the variables, the obstacles that the industrial capital experienced had a lot to do with the unrivaled and incomparable geological bounties of the Soviet Union. I know some people don't like to hear it, but Russia, the Russian territory, has natural warehouses of minerals and metals. And remember, minerals and metals, for you and me, there might be a question of rocks, dirty rocks. Some of us have some collections of minerals. For industrial capital, these are the raw materials for the production, not just of everything we have, everything we consume. They are the raw materials for the production of the means of production. Producing the means of production, in the case of the American Empire, means producing the means of warfare. So when the Soviet Union truly gave the world a spectacular mining and metallurgical revolution, it did, building the conditions, very difficult geography, but building the conditions under which its natural geological bounties allowed it to build a certain autonomous project of industrialization, coupled with the beginnings of revolutionary processes and nationalist upheavals in the periphery. This, in the 1960s, made, obviously, put monopoly industrial capital in a difficult circumstance. The United States then, I know some people speak in terms of neoliberalism, neoliberal reforms. It's a euphemism for what happened in the 1970s. It's a bad term. Don't use it, because the United States is going to build the conditions under which, given that we have to say it, given that the Soviet Union forced the empire to confront itself with its perennial structural vulnerability, geological deficits. The United States, the empire, has always had to rely upon extraterritorial geological boundaries in order for us to have the fruits and the progress of industry here. Without monopolistic grabbing of extraterritorial geological boundaries, there cannot be any American empire. Now, when the Soviet Union then turns out to be self-sufficient in the production of raw materials, this is when the United States puts in place a decade-long counter-revolution. Some sociologists call it a monetarist counter-revolution, in order to rescue industrial capital from its own crisis. There are other dynamics at stake. There are rises and falls of different productive regions. Conditions in the periphery were changing. But in the 1970s and 1980s, what we see is that the United States, in agreement, and obviously these were difficult negotiations, but basically in agreements with rich Western economies, launches a monetarist counter-revolution. What did the monetarist counter-revolution did? Picture it, you need to have a cinematographic mentality. It means that the empire put its best assets, warfare, means of warfare, to the service of a conglomerate of global banks. Withdraws these assets, the condition, the support it was giving to industrial capital, kind of dispensed from helping industrial capital and turned into building the conditions under which banks, American banks first, under which these banks could then kind of fill the vacuum and assume a different kind of monopoly capital. You have to imagine that it is going to create in the 1980s and 1990s, again, the most conspicuous sides of this counter-revolution. The most conspicuous side was the entire question of privatization of mining enterprises, mergers and acquisitions, the rise of what I call mining giants, displacing small-time competitors. But when we get then to the 1990s and the 2000s, we see then that the old era of monopoly industrial capital, that the empire does not grow by sustaining monopolies of industry. What keeps the empire alive and what allows the empire and capital to precisely do what capital here does best, production of means of warfare. It is this kind of financial monopolies, which obviously presents a more dynamic scenario for the periphery, a more dynamic scenario where only a few peripheries, in my view, and I know we have discussed this question in our collective, but only a few peripheries enjoy the conditions under which they can exploit the problems of this kind of monopoly capital today. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Nick, but it goes in that direction. The answer should go in that direction.
Yeah, it does answer the question. And I think we'll return to some of those questions later on. But I want to turn to Abby and your work, especially on how you trace discourses regarding wilderness, wildlife, and the livelihoods that are deployed by African states and imperialist institutions and foreign capital to subjugate African economies and new logics of what you call accumulation from above and below, and how we think of this concept of wilderness, and especially how it's mobilized in in its historical context of how we understand nature and this sort of bifurcation of nature and society. That's useful for capitalist logics, but how that really plays into the present moment, because oftentimes we think of conservation as taking land outside of and taking it out of production, right? To protect it and to preserve it. And it might kind of seem like a left turn in the conversation that we just had, but actually it's very fundamental to how we understand global capitalism, particularly in this moment. And so maybe I'll turn it over to you to elaborate a little bit more on those concepts.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, Jeannette, for this brilliant analysis. And so much was coming to mind as you were speaking, and everything I kept hearing, came back to this voracious greed for more natural resources, how these new schemes that the imperialist core continue to engage in, right? To be able to accumulate more, but also to engage in extraterritorial grabbing of resources to support accumulation in the imperial core, right? And to me, this is where the foundation of conservation, right? This is how, even when we talk about wilderness, Arshana Prasad, who's an Indian Marxist environmental historian, talks about wilderness as the reconfiguration of nature, for example, right? The reconfiguration of nature in support of capitalist accumulation, right? It's a form of it's really constructing the discourse of the wilderness apparatus in service to be able to grab more of those land. Right now, we know a lot has already been written on wilderness, right? So I don't want to, so much has already been written on it, but the point that I was trying to make is that wilderness is also, it's not just a Eurocentric way of understanding nature, but it has a very specific function too within global capitalism. And I talk about wilderness, but it's wilderness enclosures is a form of conservation. So I'm going to talk about, conservation specifically, right? So Jeannette, as I was saying, talked about Voracio's need for natural resources, right? But what other ways, other than waging wars, can these resources be acquired with very little public scrutiny, right? Like conservation is one of those ways, right? Because who wants to question protecting wildlife in Africa, right? Nobody. You'd be seen as the bad guy or the bad person to go against wildlife conservationists because they're looking to save the elephants, not even thinking about how these wildlife actually roam over vast expanses of land that are very rich in water resources, very rich in mining resources, right? And so under the pretext of wildlife conservation, you have these private firms or foreign capital that manages to merge with environmental conservation NGOs to basically dictate environmental and conservation policies in Africa, right? All with the aim of gaining control over land ownership over these vast expanses of land. So conservation in Africa really, how would I say it? It allows for a monopolistic land ownership structure where foreign entities actually have control over those land, right? And that also matters because in terms of how you think about what those resources under, on those land are. You have water resources, mining resources, as I was saying, but also these are land that are also very rich in biodiversity, species abundance, right? Species diversity that also matter for the biotech industry. There is a lot of biotech industry for pharmaceutical companies, for example, that take place within those spaces. And so to me, conservation is just a veil for further resource grab, not only in this specific moment, but also to reserve African land, but also African biodiversity for future exploitation, right? In time of capitalist crisis in the imperial core, then some of these conservation land can be declassified to further the exploitation of resources. There is a reason why the lands that are targeted currently under the Convention of Biological Diversity are targeting indigenous land, not, obviously in the US, in Latin America, but also in Africa, because those are some of the richest land in terms of biodiversity, as I was saying, but also these are places, again, that have very critical minerals, right, within those spaces. But all of this, I mean, Jeannette talks about the geological, she said it so well, geological resources within those spaces. And so what actually lies within the land where that are currently targeted for conservation? We already know that there's a lot of mining activities that happen on those places, right? There's tons of mining activities that still take place on protected areas, right? But there's also a lot of bioprospecting that is happening, right? And so all of these lands are put not just for the future, but also for for future resource grabs as well. And so I don't know if, this is where, again, getting back to what Jeannette was saying is, thinking about the extraterritorial grabbing of resources. That's exactly what conservation is doing, right? There's also something else, though. When I wanted to go back to your question that you asked earlier about imperialism, right? Imperialism obviously is, as Jeannette had talked about earlier, is really a form of economic control and exploitation of land and resources, right? That's one. But I also want to echo what Bikram Gill, who's also who's been on the podcast before, like his definition of imperialism start with the denial of sovereignty and sovereign development planning in peripheral nations, for example, right? And this really resonated when you think about conservation, because conservation in Africa puts lands and resources out of productions, right? Land, forests, and water resources that could be redirected towards supporting local livelihoods. I mean, we know that food insecurity is a rampant issue, but also energy poverty is also a big issue there. So, land, water, and forests that can be redirected towards supporting sovereign development practices, but those ones, sovereign development planning, but those land and water resources are dictated to be taken out of production completely, right? This is a Western-led conservation agenda. They tell us, no, you cannot use your land, you cannot use your forest, nor your water resources to produce what you need in your country. Think about it. A country like Tanzania, for example, has 45%, 45% of its territory completely taken out of production in service of conservation. My country, which is, in Senegal, has 25% of its land taken out of conservation. Taken out of production for conservation, and all of that land is concessioned out to foreign capital, either for tourism. Everyone knows that it's very much used for tourism, obviously, but also for mining operations. And there's very little, very little public scrutiny about mining operations that actually do happen on those conservation lands. Forest, which one is it? The Rainforest Foundation, for example, is currently mapping all of the private mining concessions that are happening in the Congo River Basin, where protected areas are actually also located. So it really raises that question at the end of the day, right? Like, what exactly, who is, what is the function of conservation? Is it really to curb or to save biodiversity? Is it really to serve wildlife? Is it really working in service of local communities, or is it actually serving global capitalist accumulation? It's become this new frontier of resource grab, this new frontier of global capitalist expansion.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for that, Abby, because it's. I think conservation often is the sort of liberal or idealistic response to the very things that Jeannette is talking about, to say, now we need to protect these areas from these very interests. And one thing that you're really good at pointing out in your work, and I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on it, is like the role of finance capital in conservation, in the conservation industry or the conservation project, and the way that they back up these NGOs, which are sort of becomes arms of the state and also arms of finance capital. And what role, like, if you could just start by naming them, because there's like the World Wildlife Foundation, which I think a lot of people are familiar, but if you want to just name them, who they're tied to, and the sort of the intention behind their conservation projects in these particular regions, because you also point out that areas like the states that you look at in Africa have larger conservation areas than places like Canada and the United States, which often are touted as sort of like liberal, progressive environmentalists. but yeah, maybe there's a lot to sort of take on there, but maybe you can start by elaborating on that sort of finance capital element.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thanks for that question, Nick. So let me just start with a concrete example of the financialization of conservation, right? There are about 5 major international environmental agencies that have the financial muscle to dictate the ecological agenda or the natural resource and economic policies in African nations, right? You can think about the World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, African Wildlife Society, and there's a third one that escaped me. But there are about 5 major conservation NGOs that are very active on the continent. And so, when you think, once you look at the leadership of those conservation NGOs, I mean, it becomes so clear how much finance capital has completely captured conservation. Right. This is why when Jeannette was talking about the alliances of multinationals and how states have reinvented laws, for example, to be able to facilitate the expansion of finance capital, for example, this is exactly what's happening in Africa. Right. These NGOs have the financial muscle to dictate policies, but also to capture the government. Kenya is one of them. I mean, conservation is huge there. You're going to national parks, right? That's part of the story, right? You go to nature reserve. Those are protected areas as well, but also even community-based conservancies also are part of it, right? They dictate how land and resources should be protected, right? And also integrated into the economy itself. Sorry, the national economy. And I'm going to quote really quickly, one of my favorite quotes from Walter Rodney, who wrote in the Problems of a Third World in 1970, where he calls protected areas wildlife republics, but also, and I wrote a piece maybe 2-3 years ago called Against Wildlife Republics, right? Trying to raise all of these issues. But Walter Rodney really pointed this out so well in saying that wildlife conservation in Africa is a form of subjugating local economies, right? And this is all national economies. And that is exactly what we're seeing today, right? So let me just go back to the financial piece really quickly. So I name all of those NGOs. These are all organizations that are led by Western capitalists who are in private equity or hedge fund sectors. They're also in mining sectors and also the military industrial complex. This is why a lot of these protected areas today are heavily, heavily militarized. They're not just privatized, they're also militarized. And think about the discourse around poaching, for example, right? I mean, you have wildlife biologists who lobby Congress and Senate in the U.S. to increase the military fundings towards anti-poaching units in Africa. But that's a conversation for another day. I mean, the military-industrial complex is heavily, heavily involved in wildlife conservation too in Africa. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but I just wanted to point that out. So think about, for example, the Nature Conservancy is run by Matthew Arnold from JP Morgan Chase, right? That's the Nature Conservancy. WWF, which is the World Wildlife Fund, is run by Carter Roberts, who is associated with major corporations like Walmart, Cargill, and Procter & Gamble. Then you have Conservation International, which is led by Wes Bush, who is former CEO of Northrop Grumman. Northrop Grumman is a weapons, manufacturer, right? All of this, I mean, what is a weapon manufacturer actually doing in conservation? These are the people leading environmental conservation in Africa. This is why we're saying, and it's not just in Africa, in Asia as well, but especially much more accentuated in Africa, I would say. Right, like you have all of these, finance capital, private equity, military industrial complex, mining sector, right? and monopoly finance, all of these different sectors are now controlling the conservation sector in Africa. Okay, so there is a total capture of monopoly and finance capital of the African conservation agenda as this new domain of accumulation at a time of heightened, ecological and capitalist crisis. So you have the conversions of ecology, of the ecological crisis and the capitalist crisis that are interlocked, and there's a total, complete, like I say, that has enabled the capture, the private capture of the ecological agenda completely without very little scrutiny. And so there's also other aspect I wanted to bring up, is I think we need to ask these important questions as to why is finance or monopoly capital so invested in conservation in Africa? I mean, why, right? Why are private equity firms so invested in saving wildlife or curbing the rapid decline of biodiversity? Is it their altruism or their environmental consciousness? I mean, I wouldn't think so, right? Like, we've seen that they're so voracious that I have no issue in the ecological destruction in order to accumulate more wealth, right? Or is it that they really believe that capitalism can resolve the ecological crisis? Or within conservation, right? Do they really believe that carbon or biodiversity offset or market can curb, say, for example, deforestation, or save wildlife or protect biodiversity in Africa? I mean, these are basic questions that we need to ask. Why is finance and monopoly capital so invested in biodiversity conservation, right? And to me, the fundamental logic operating there is that finance capitalism is invested in conservation for the sole purpose of grabbing more land and resources for not only the present accumulation, but also for future use. There's already a lot of talk in African media, especially in social media, that this interest in critical, rare earth mineral, for example, right? Like where that some of these conservation land, especially in transboundary, what we call transboundary conservation area, that there are mineral earth interests within those spaces, right? And so that this rapid investment in like expanding conservation area is exactly a pretext to integrate more land, more resources within the global capitalist system, right? And also to gain control in the future for critical mineral resources and also water resources. We've seen it in Patagonia, for example, Argentina. And I mean, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but like there's new forms of grabs that are happening that are not just land grab, but also water resource grabs. Okay, and thinking about, I'm thinking, I'll give you really quickly one example of these forms of new models of conservations that are happening in Africa. Like you have the what we call transboundary conservation areas. Transboundary conservation areas are basically formed to connect contiguous wildlife habitat, but also biological corridors, right? So to connect different forests together just to make sure that the pretext is for wildlife to be able to move across different boundaries, but to connect from one habitat to the other. However, some of these, I mean, like, they cover millions and millions hectares of land across different states, across different nation states in Africa. So one of them, for example, is the Kavango Zambezi Transboundary Conservation Area, which is in Southern Africa, which is one of the largest land-based transfrontier conservation area, which is covering the Zambezi River Basin, but also the Okavango River Basin. I mean, these are important water resources in South Africa, in Southern Africa, in a time of drought. Right? Do we really, do we want some of these land, some of these water resources to be put in the hands of hedge fund managers who are already talking about the privatization of water resources, who are already talking about, how water now has become the future or the new gold in a way, right? Like the new critical resource. We're seeing water grabs happening in Argentina already, right? Like the Land Matrix and the Argentina Land Observatory has written a really great report on the new dynamics around land and water grabs in Argentina, and all of those are happening right in Patagonia, not very far from some of these protected areas, and they're also in transboundary spaces. So, this is where, again, like asking why it is so important to ask why finance capital, why monopoly capital are currently completely captured and so invested in conservation.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Abby. That was a really kind of wonderful explanation of something that is often seen as a good for humanity and for the planet is so bound up in the very things that Jeannette, laid out in terms of advancing the interests of this, what Marx would call the primitive accumulation of these these minerals, but then also the kind of financial aspect of it by controlling these states and creating zones that are also tied to this excessive militarization by U.S. interests to protect their own interests in the region. And I want to just take a step back and say, first of all, if you're listening to this, please subscribe to the Red Nation podcast. We have links in the chat and the show notes, but also more importantly, please subscribe to the Anti-Imperialist Scholar Collective YouTube channel, where this is being cross-streamed. You can find that just by typing in Anti-Imperialist Scholar Collective. You can also find the work of the Anti-Imperialist Scholar Collective at anti-imperialist.com, and that's with the hyphen, anti-imperialist.com. So check out the work there, subscribe to the newsletter. There's almost monthly magazines that come out. I'm actually co-editing a July issue on the sort of counter-revolution of 1776. So lots of exciting stuff. There was a recent one that just came out on International Women's Day. Really amazing work, mixing both original pieces as well as historical documents or republished pieces. So that's been incredibly useful for me. I've actually given it to students. I've given it to colleagues and comrades to check it out. I've learned a lot from it as well. But I kind of want to shift gears a little bit too, in thinking about the origins of this conversation and why I invited both Jeannette and Abby on here. It was a conversation that started in a group chat that we were having, and I think I posted this social media ad or something, or about a Chinese solar field, and it was kind of we look at China's in many ways is advancing what we know as green technology or renewable energy. In many ways, it is far more advanced socially and politically and economically than the United States is in implementing these things. But both Abby and Jeannette sort of corrected me and had a more critical take, and understanding that this stuff doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It comes from the raw materials of the earth, right? And thinking about how the concept of critical minerals, I actually first heard that concept in the lead up to the Joe Biden campaign in when did he get elected? In 2020. And he was talking about, he had met with unions in the United States, and he was talking about securing America's interest and stake in critical minerals, and specifically with this eye towards China. And after reading and engaging with Jeannette's work, I can now understand why he was making that commitment with these labor unions and seeking to develop a domestic, critical mineral infrastructure. Even though, as you say, Jeannette, and point out so poignantly, that there is a geological deficit that the United States has in terms of acquiring these things, but how they're so necessary and tied into the arms industry and the United States' militarization of the globe. So I want to ask a question and pose a question to both of you about thinking about this new Cold War in China and understanding its relationship not just to the militarization of the globe, but also to this idea of a turn towards green technology as a transition away from carbon and fossil fuel development, which is obviously causing global warming, but how this green transition, or this turn towards eco-modernism, or green techno-fixes for climate change and energy demands also sort of reinforces or reproduces the very sort of logics and the very sort of processes that got us here in the first place. And this might seem sort of counterintuitive to a lot of people because it's like, we don't want pipelines, but we want wind turbines, or we don't want pipelines, but we want solar panels, ignoring sort of the sort of the need for energy demands, and how they sort of contribute to our current imperialist moment and the sort of economic expression of imperialism, as both of you have been talking about. So I'll turn first to Jeannette, because you write a lot on the mining industry, and it's how it's tied into the arms industry. But you've also thought a lot about how the mining industry is also intrinsically tied to this sort of green transition or green technology or renewable energy industry as well, and how that isn't necessarily a solution to climate change, but maybe anti-imperialist, maybe you can elaborate on sort of anti-imperialist ways we can think about solutions to climate change and this particular moment.
It's a phenomenal question, precisely because it is the sort of question that we Marxists cannot answer without a lengthy explanation. And the first thing I want to say is that there is, for us Marxists, we are witnessing and we are part of two functionally linked world-scale revolutions. One is what some Marxist historians have called an ongoing scientific revolution. We are not aware of it, but what it seems that in the last 4 or 5 decades, the world entered into, or the rich core entered into that sort of slow motion scientific process of knowledge production. So that's one assumption in order for us to engage with the question of green technology. The second assumption is that there is indeed a move towards greening technology. There is indeed a move towards saving energy costs. There is indeed a move towards exploiting more intensely the bulk of raw materials available to us. A more intensive process of exploitation that takes advantage of everything the raw material has to offer. And this is a question of science, this is a question of technology, this is a question of, obviously, industrial profits. But what we need to understand is that under the present conditions of the capitalist world economy, both processes find their organic motion in the sustainability of the empire. There is a move towards sustainability, but the question is, what exactly is it that industries, that green industries, that finance capital of the sort that Abby described, what exactly are these folks trying to sustain? It is the sustainability of the empire to the extent that the empire provides the sort of political cohesion for the forces that put in motion capital accumulation to continue. So this is a big, it obviously presents us with a bundle of contradictions. And the second thing I need to say is that we Marxists are not afraid of contradictions. This is what we study because capital, the history of capital, since 1492, the history of capital is it's a contradictory process. Accumulation, endless accumulation engenders contradictions. So even if what I'm saying sounds contradictory, great, it's supposed to sound contradictory. Now, what does it mean in terms of the Second Cold War, which is not a Second Cold War, it's not cold any longer, but what does it mean in terms of how the empire sees its horizon of competition with respect to China? This is a difficult question. This is a difficult question for a number of reasons. The first one is that, and I say it openly because we have to. The first one is that Marxism is a Eurocentric corpus. And I know some good intellectuals, some good comrades insist that there is a distinction between Western Marxism and non-Western Marxism, but Marxism, by definition, is a Eurocentric corpus. It means that Marxism has enabled us to raise the sort of questions that Nick and Abby are raising, but does not allow us to fully answer the question without borrowing. We have to go into other fields, other epistemologies, other knowledges in order to understand this, how the empire sees itself with respect to China, so that we can also understand the kind of internal revolution in production that began in China, that has been going on in China for decades. So it's a big question there. I'm afraid I'm not the person to address it because my focus of attention is the Americas and the Western world. But if I were to draw analogies, if I were to say to give the embryo of the beginnings of an explanation based upon what the empire is doing and has done in the Americas, this is what I would have to say. The United States, given these conditions, the ongoing scientific revolution and the move towards saving energy costs to sustain capital, not to sustain my lifestyle, not to sustain the working class of America. No, it's to sustain capital. So given these conditions, the United States has a structural problem when it comes to the question of China. It's a problem for which the empire has no solution. And the empire here means a political and economic machine that is structurally tilted towards the production of means of warfare. This is what empire means. This is the first important historical vocabulary of this conversation. So this kind of empire has a structural problem when it comes to China because since the empire put in place the conditions for the liberalization of finance capital, a dimension of this liberalization is we have learned about it because of the work of Abby. This liberalization of finance capital takes that kind of direction. Now, the mass of capital available to truly push the economy of the empire in the direction of a different framework, a different understanding, a different engagement with natural resources. This is not possible. This is not possible. All of that talk, it's a historical, it's not possible. Because it's industrial capital in its glorious moments of industrial supremacy, when industry commanded the destiny of the national economy, but also the projection of the empire globally. Its industry had already built the conditions under which capital was going to be reproduced. And the condition was one and one only. The condition was that capital, in order for capital to grow, capital must incessantly withdraw itself from the realm of development, from the realm of progress. It must incessantly, this is a dynamic process, incessantly it turns its back from the sort of investment questions and development questions that I believe I detect in the question you posed, Nick. It's a structural limitation American capital has. It cannot take us there. It cannot produce development, full stop. It just can't. The moment it decides to do so, then we are talking about a stage in history beyond the empire, and a stage in history beyond the monopoly of finance capital. And I want briefly to go back to the question of finance capital, because the work of Abby, the work of Abby teaches us what finance capital does in over surface land to the wealth of nations. And I'm sorry that in the Red Nation podcast I have to cite Adam Smith, but it's a good term, right? it's what finance capital does, the sort of land grabbing, the sort of closing, creating very, very dangerous frontiers, right? Protecting land, monopolizing land, but it's truly kind of fencing land. It's fencing land. Well, you have to imagine that if finance capital drives economic growth of the United States or drives the United States forward, drives the empire forward, the logic of finance capital, it's also an obstacle. It's also an obstacle for the United States to even contemplate a scenario of development. Because what finance capital does, it's, first of all, finance capital does not create value. Labor does. Finance capital doesn't create anything. Finance capital attaches itself to different stages of production, of all productive activities of the country, attaches itself to different stages of production of every single chain of production of industrial activity of the country, with the intention not of accumulating profits, no, with the intention of extorting. It's an extortionist, with the intention of grabbing industrial profits, grabbing profits before the stages of production, before production is completed. So finance capital today suffocates industrial capital. This is why we Marxists speak about deindustrialization in the US. It attaches itself to industry in a way that suffocates the developmental potential of industry. So under those conditions, it is obvious that the United States has no economic basis to speak about development, about green technology, about saving the planet. It just cannot do it.
Thanks for that, Jeannette. Abby, do you want to take up this question of eco-modernism and how green technology, contributes to the very things that, like, much in the same way that conservation, as you pointed out, really contributes to this kind of imperialist land grab and resource grab, especially in African states?
Oh, okay, here we go. Well, yeah, thank you so much for this question. And, Jeannette always gives so much to think about, even in terms of my own work. And the way I was actually thinking about that, when we had that conversation in the chat, it just occurred to me that for me, it's just a basic principle, right? Like, and thinking about, for example, some of these mining corporations that are now buying concessions onto protected areas, but also at the same time, while they're mining in those spaces, on the other hand, they're purchasing what they call biodiversity offset to basically green their extraction, right? So they're basically mining in one area, right? Destructing in one area while financing more and more protected land, more and more biodiversity conservation land on the other side, right? And there's a example of that in an op-ed that we published. Some of my colleagues and I called "When Conservation and Mining Meet," right? That the mining industry now is very much in bed with the conservation industry to create what they call a green steel, right? I mean, that is literally how they call it, right? It's either green steel or there's another oxymoron as such that they're using, right? And so to me, this is why, and it's the same one too, right? With like wind farms, for example, right, that are also at the same time dispossessing agrarian communities, pastoralist communities, fisheries, and so on and so forth in order to produce, green energy, right? And so what is exactly the cost, right? For me, it's a green transition still where Africans and indigenous communities continue to bear the brunt of capitalist accumulation, right, within this new green energy transition. Like, where is the space of indigenous and African agrarian communities within these green transition if they continue to yet again being alienated from their land, right, in service of green capitalism? And so to me, this is where, again, the contradiction lies, right? Like, at whose cost is this transition happening? But also, it's not also, biodiversity offset is not necessarily, or even, carbon offset obviously is not offsetting anything, right? It's not offsetting capitalist extraction, ecological destruction. I'll give you an example just to think. It makes me think about the CBD framework 30 by 30. I don't know if you've heard of it or not, Nick. But it's the plan to double the amount of protected areas by 2030, right? I mean, right now, 16%. There's already 16% of the global territorial coverage. 16% of our territorial coverage are already under protected areas. 2/3 of those are in the global South. Actually, Latin America and the Caribbean have some of the largest proportion of protected areas. Just on a note, Venezuela actually has, but Venezuela has a very different form, obviously, right? It's a much more socialist-oriented form of conservation planning. But most of these are being targeted, again, in Africa. That's why you have this rapid scale of pastoralists. And I keep talking about pastoralists because they've been over and over again targeted for very different reasons. Their land have been targeted over and over again for conservation. And so carbon offset, biodiversity offset, all of these talk of green energy, right, is driving this rapid alienation for conservation as well, right? Like, again, this push to double the amount of protected areas by 2030, right? We're already sitting at 17%. And so we have about 5 more years to alienate more, to dispossess more, and then consider those ones for protected areas into our push for energy and green transition, or greening our economy, greening African economies as well. And so this is why, to me, green energy is such an oxymoron, because at whose cost is it, right? Who's paying? The burden always lies on the poorest, the agrarian communities, the farmers, the fishers, right? The subsistence hunters, whether it's in Africa and Asia or even in Latin America. They're the one losing their land at such a rapid scale in order to support this, green transition.
Let me just jump in quickly and say that what the message we are trying to convey is that these are not accidents of capitalism. These are not side effects It doesn't mean that something went wrong. This is how capitalism designed its functioning. And this is how the peripheries, the weak nations, the poor, this is how they deepen their integration to the core of the system. So if there is a common message that comes from Abby's work and mine, is that what Marx wrote about the history of primary or primitive accumulation as a past of capitalism, it's wrong. It is the present of capitalism. Capitalism learned to make it very dynamic. Pillaging, theft, rape, extortion. This is the face of capital in the periphery, on top, above ground, and below ground.
Yes, thanks. Thanks so much, Jeannette and Abby, for your comments here, and very insightful. I was like listening, taking notes, learning a lot. Not just from what you've written, but also from what you presented today. And one of the key things that I want people to take away with, and I was thinking about a recent talk that the Cuban ambassador gave here when she had visited Minneapolis, and she was talking about, Cuba's not against technology. Cuba's not against development, right? And there's this idea that, when we look at how imperialism attacks anti-imperialist countries, it's meant to stop their development, right? It's meant to maldevelop them, to return them to the state of pupillage, to the empire, right? And it was just a fascinating thing that she was saying, because I think sometimes in the West, when people hear us talk about these things in the way that we're talking about them in imperial supply chains and primitive accumulation and enclosure, it almost assumes that we're also against technology, we're against development. And I'm glad that Abby had brought up the example of Venezuela and the idea of alternative, socialist development models that are designed to integrate, not to integrate, but to socially produce these spaces that reflect not just wildlife or wilderness as it's understood,
Yes.
absent of human interaction or production, but actually how you ethically, sustainably, like in an actual sustainable model, produce those relationships that produce a different kind of value, one that isn't to be used only for surplus and profit, but one that's actually used for human dignity, right? Mm-hmm. As well as the dignity and the integrity of the landscape. So I just wanted to kind of bring that element up, because actually, as Jeannette has pointed out, capitalist development actually arrests social development. It arrests political development. I would argue it arrests spiritual and moral development, yes, right? To ethically live in sustainable ways on this planet. So I want to turn to both of you really quickly, if you have any sort of parting thoughts, things that you want our listeners to check out, or things that you're reading right now that you think really speak to the conversation that we just had. I'll turn it to Abby first, and then we can close out with Jeannette.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me what I'm reading now, because I'm digesting this book. It's by Marxist political ecologist Enrique Leff, who wrote a book called Political Ecology. And I mean, to me, what his book, and I mean, it's a very big, it's quite a thick book, but it relates a lot of what I've been talking about today, and even thinking about this dichotomy between conservation and development, limit to economic growth, for example, that have been imposed, as an environmental consciousness in the 70s, and how African states have also rejected, or third world countries have rejected, this idea of limit to economic growth in order to curb, the ecological crisis, right? And then how he's also redefining political ecology as, much more of an ontological, how do you say, I'm going to paraphrase him here, but like thinking about political ecology not just as a power relations, or, or how the power relations actually shape not economic outcome, but ecological crisis, but think about it too from an ontological perspective, right? Like that these protected areas are also indigenous ways of life, right? These are what he called territories, life-giving territories. And how do we redefine protected areas, not just only conservation areas, right? Like as a life territories, like reclaiming these spaces for a completely new way of not, economic rationalities that is much more ingrained within the way, outside of the capitalist, dominant capitalist narrative. So that's what I'm reading now, Enrique Liff, Political Ecology.
I'm reading I have the bad habit of reading various books simultaneously. I'm reading a book on how to write history, Joseph Fontana, a Catalan Marxist historian. I believe he's probably the best of the 20th century. He died a few years ago. But I'm also reading a very nice historical novel by Ismail Kadare. The morons of the Swedish Academy never gave him a Nobel Prize in literature, but what can you expect from from Europeans? But historical novels of the time of the Ottoman Empire, and I want to take advantage of this opportunity to say to the audience, especially the younger crowds out there, that the work we do, the ideas we develop here, they are obviously the outcome of lonely and patient hours in libraries, the work Abby has done, the work Nick is doing, the work our comrades are doing in the Anti-Imperialist Collective. And we read a lot of material directly linked to the questions of empire. But you have to see that question in multiple dimensions. So grab any book, some funky title, even if it's not directly related to what you do, just to cultivate your spirit. Because as Nick said, capitalism thrives at dehumanizing us, and we have to fight back.
Well, thank you both for joining us. Again, for those of you who are listening to this stream, please subscribe to the Anti-Imperialist Scholar Collective YouTube. Go to antiimperialist.com to subscribe to the newsletter. Thank you, Jeannette. Thank you, Abby, for joining us. This was a really wonderful conversation. And we hope to have you back on in the future. And we hope to see you co-hosting the AISC podcast in the future as well. So
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.